you have your Bible, would you turn to the book of Exodus, chapter 25? Exodus 25. It's page 58 in the Bibles the church provides. They're either in the rack in front of you or underneath your seat. We've been discussing the tabernacle in the latter half of the book of Exodus, and the tabernacle is all about how Israel could have God present in their midst on an ongoing basis. And more importantly, it is a message to us about how we can have God present in our lives on a daily basis, wherever we go and whatever we do. Now, so far this summer, we've looked at Bezalel, which are the accountants, the engineers, the housewives, the whomever, people using their vocational skills, abilities, experiences, talents for the sake of the kingdom. And when that happens, God is present in the midst of those, and he is known to his people. We also looked at how when we give generously of our material possessions, this enables God to be present with us, and especially when we give out of hearts of gratitude. Last week, Bruce took you through the Ark of the Covenant, which is one of the pieces of furniture in the tabernacle, which represents the presence of God to his people. And he talked about how through the atonement in Jesus Christ, we are able to experience God's presence. Now, the tabernacle can be a little confusing because the Ark of the Covenant is only one of many pieces of furniture. And so what I thought we would do this morning, just for a moment, so that we don't lose the forest because of the trees, is sort of talk a little bit about the whole tabernacle, about how all of this furniture works together, because it all has to do with the presence of God in the midst of Israel. Now, there's a visual that we have. Normally, it's in your notes. You don't have notes today. It's on the screen above you, and that shows sort of a pictorial representation of what the tabernacle might have looked like. Now, in the tabernacle, there were 6 pieces of furniture. We have many of those represented here in the sanctuary today. And God, as he spells out what those pieces of furniture are to be, he starts with the most important piece. You see, we sometimes start on the outside and work our way in. God starts on the inside of the tabernacle and works his way out. And the most important piece of furniture in the tabernacle by far is the Ark of the Covenant. It's represented up here in this beautiful model that Carl has made for us. You can also see it on the screen, which is all the way to your right, my left, where the light is. And that was, the Ark of the Covenant represents God's presence with his people. Now, that was behind a curtain. Ours is not behind the curtain because you wouldn't be able to see it. But in the tabernacle, it was beyond a curtain, and it was in a room called the Holy of Holies, or the Most Holy Place. And that's where God was really tangibly present with his people. Now, in the next room, you see the sort of cutaway up there. You have the next room, which is the tabernacle proper, which is outside of the Most Holy Place. It's the Holy Place. And in the Holy Place, there are 3 pieces of furniture. The first, you can see the first is here. It's over to my left, your right, and it is a golden table on which something called the bread of the presence was. There was also a lampstand, or a menorah, which Carl just finished for us, I think, this week, which is represented here. And then there is the altar of incense, which we've displayed over here, and you can see up there in front of the Ark of the Covenant. These 3 pieces were in the inner room, not the most inner room, but the next room, and they represent the benefits we receive from God's presence with us. So in the inside, the innermost room is the symbol of God's presence. In the next room are these 3 pieces, and they symbolize the benefits you and I receive from having God present in our lives. And then in the courtyard, which is the outer area here, there are 2 more pieces of furniture. The first is the basin, which Carl did not make this. We borrowed this. It's not quite to scale, but it's represented by this piece of furniture right down here. And then the brazen altar, which you can see all the way to your left in the picture, which is represented by the big piece of furniture in the back of the sanctuary. You probably have seen that as you have come in. That is the brazen altar and the basin. And what these 2 pieces of furniture represent is what is necessary for us to come into God's presence. So you have the presence of God represented by the Ark of the Covenant, 3 pieces of furniture that symbolize the benefits that God's people get from his presence, and then 2 pieces of furniture which symbolize what is necessary to have God present in our lives. Does that make sense? That's sort of the big picture of what's going on in the tabernacle. And what we're going to do is systematically walk through furniture, piece of furniture by piece of furniture. Bruce started us out last week looking at the Ark of the Covenant. This week we're going to talk about the golden table on which you have what's called the bread of the presence. So if you're in Exodus 25, I'm going to read verses 23 to 30. 23 to 30. If you notice, beginning of verse 10 was the ark, 23 to 30, the table, then the lampstand, so on and so forth. Exodus 25, verses 23 to 30. Make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits long, a cubit wide, and a cubit and a half high. Overlay it with pure gold, and make a gold molding around it. Also make around it a rim, a handbreadth wide, and put a gold molding on the rim. Make 4 gold rings for the table, and fasten them to the 4 corners where the legs are. The rings are to be close to the rim to hold the poles used in carrying the table. Make the poles of acacia wood, overlay them with gold, and carry the table with them. You can see the poles in Carl's model. And make its plates and dishes of pure gold, as well as its pitchers and bowls for the pouring out of offerings. Put the bread of the presence on this table to be before me at all times. Now, there's lots of things associated with this table, but the single most important thing is the bread. And bread is meant to symbolize something. You see here that there are 12 loaves of bread. This was to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And what this was meant to symbolize is that what this table is about is for everybody. So although only the priest will ever minister at this table, what the table symbolizes was meant for every single Israelite, not just for the priests. And the symbol is that of bread. Now, what do you think of when you think of bread? Think of food, provision, sustenance. And that's what the table represents, is that God's presence provides for his people. When God is with us, he provides what we need. Now, there's lots of things about the way the table was built, which was supposed to communicate about how God provides for us. But the most important one that I want to talk about this morning is in verse 30. It says, the bread, those 12 loaves, are to be before me at all times. What that means is that there was never supposed to be a moment in which bread was not on that table. Now, the bread was to be exchanged every Sabbath. Leviticus 24 tells us that every Saturday you would take out the old bread and you would put in the new bread, but there was never supposed to be a day that went by in which there wasn't bread on the table. And although the Bible doesn't tell us exactly how they did the exchange of old bread for new, most scholars believe that instead of taking off the 12 old loaves, taking them out and then bringing in the 12 new loaves, what they did was take off one old loaf and replace it with one new loaf and do it one at a time. And the reason was because God said, the bread is to be before me at all times. And so they didn't want even for 1 second for there not to be bread on this table. And the reason for that was it was the symbol of God's provision. That God is always ready and able to provide for the needs of his people by means of his presence. Now, not only does Leviticus 24 tell us that it was supposed to be replaced every week, it says that the bread on the table was supposed to be there as a lasting ordinance, which meant forever. that you were to continue week after week after week for years and years and years, to continue to replace the bread so that the bread would always be there, symbolizing that God's presence with his people was a promise that he was making forever. For hundreds of years, the Israelites did this, so that hundreds of years later, the bread is still there at the tabernacle. Let me show that to you. Turn over, if you will, to 1 Samuel chapter 21. 1 Samuel chapter 21. We're going to read a couple of passages today, so I'm going to have you turn to them. If you're turning from your right to your left, you'll get pretty close to 1 Samuel after a little while. Chapter 21 is page 207. Now, while you're turning your pages, you are also turning through hundreds of years of history for the life of Israel. We're coming in 1 Samuel 21 to the time of Saul and to David, and Saul is the first king of Israel. And this is long after the Exodus and long after Israel has finally settled in their land. Saul is the first king and David is his son-in-law. There is a problem, however, and maybe some father-in-laws feel this way about their sons-in-law, is that Saul wants to kill his son-in-law. And so David is on the run. Now he's got a few men with him, but they don't have any food and they don't have any weapons. And David's in some real trouble. And so he goes running to Ahimelech, who is the priest who is serving at the tabernacle. It says in 1 Samuel 21, verse 1, David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" This was not a good sign for the king's son-in-law not to be traveling with the king's guards. David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king charged me with a certain matter and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about your mission and instructions.'" That's a lie. We're not going to get into the ethics of David lying here. There's another point we want to cover. "As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find." But the priest answered David, "I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women." David replied, "Indeed, women have been kept from us, as usual whenever I set out. The men's things are holy even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?" So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and was replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. So here we have hundreds of years later, still the golden table with the 12 loaves, and they were still being replaced week after week, symbolizing that even hundreds of years later, God would be available to provide for the needs of his people. And so David understands, look, when you're out of options, when you've got nowhere to go, you can always go to God. Because God has promised, I will always be there. There's not going to be a day, an hour, a moment in which God will not be there to provide. If there's no bread in all of Israel, David knows there'll be bread at the tabernacle. And that symbolizes that if there's nowhere else you can turn for help, you can always go to God. Because God will always be there. 2 Saturday nights ago, a couple in our congregation received a letter. The woman had written me a note just this past week to tell me about this situation. And they had come home and they found in their mailbox a letter which informed them that 1/3 of their invested money was now gone because they had been invested in a company that had declared bankruptcy. It's late Saturday night. Where do you go at a time like that when you receive very devastating sort of news? Well, they did what David did. And the next morning they came to the house of the Lord. Because when you have nowhere else to go, you can always come to God. And God had prepared specifically a message that Sunday morning here just for them. And when they sat here, God met them in the midst of that message, and he provided for them peace and assurance and comfort. And she was writing me this note on behalf of her and her husband to tell me how God had met them in their time of need when they had nowhere else to turn to. And they walked out of here that Sunday morning having heard the news on Saturday. A third of their money was gone, rejoicing that God had met them. Now, those weren't my words, those were her words. Where do you go when you're in need? You come to God, because there's never a moment, never an hour, never a day, never a second in which God is not available to help, because God is a providing God. God provides. That's a fundamental part of who he is. In fact, let me show that to you. Turn back, if you will, now to Genesis chapter 22. We're going back the other way, back to Genesis chapter 22. This is page 14 and 15 in the Bible. As you're turning back, you're now flipping back hundreds of years the other direction. Back to the Exodus and then before. Back to the time of Abraham, very early on in the story of humanity. And here, very early in the Bible, God identifies himself as a God who provides. We're going to read it together. Genesis chapter 22, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about.' Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. The place is very important. He said to his servants, 'Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you.' Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, 'Father?' 'Yes, my son,' Abraham replied. 'The fire and wood are here,' Isaac said. 'But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?' Abraham answered, 'God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son.' And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, 'Abraham, Abraham!' 'Here I am,' he replied. 'Do not lay a hand on the boy,' he said. 'Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son.' Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, 'The Lord will provide.' And to this day it is said, 'On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided.'" So the first time in the Bible that God is ever named by a human, the first time he's ever actually given a name, he is identified as the God who sees me. This is the second time that God is ever given a name by a human being. And here he is identified as the God who provides. The idea is the God who sees me is the God who provides for me. And Abraham understands that fundamental to the character of God is that when there is no other hope, when you think that there is nothing but darkness ahead of you, God provides in the midst of his situation. Interestingly enough, I don't think coincidentally, we received another note this week. This was addressed to the elders of the church, and it was from a young woman. in our congregation who 8 months ago had begun to suffer some very serious and debilitating physical illnesses, but they were mystifying. She went to a doctor, and different people had looked at her, and nobody could figure out what was wrong with her. In fact, the doctor, who had been practicing for 30 years, said to her in confidence, I've never once said this to anybody, but so baffling is what's the matter with you that I can't help but think, is it possible that there's something spiritual that's causing this? And so this young woman, who had been involved in some very heavy spiritual activity and had been involved in sharing the gospel in a place of great darkness where there was a lot of spiritual warfare, she came to the church. Because where do you go when there is no answers in the human world? She came to the church, and we as elders gathered around her, and we prayed over her. And we prayed for her in the name of Jesus Christ, that this illness, whatever it was, would be healed by his power. And she was writing us this note 8 months later to say that apart from any sort of human medical intervention, God seems to have healed her, that it's suddenly gone. It's no longer there. Where do you go when there's nowhere else to turn to? Where do you go when it seems like there's no hope? You go to God, because the bread is always there. There's never a moment in which God is not able to provide. There's never a situation, even at the very last second when the knife is on the throat, there's never a situation in which there's no hope, because God can always provide. Well, this leads us today to our celebration of communion. You see, in Genesis 22, did you notice how much emphasis was on the place? God said to Abraham, go to a specific mountain, I'm going to show you. Abraham goes to a very specific place in the region of Moriah. Well, that place, that mountain on which Abraham meets the Lord and names him, the Lord will provide. Well, from that mountain where we are in Genesis chapter 22, God will lead Abraham's descendants into Egypt. There they will be enslaved, and in their slavery they will call out for help. And God will provide rescue for them, and he will take Abraham's descendants out of Egypt and lead them to Mount Sinai, and there he will give them instructions to build a golden table and to place on it bread, which will symbolize that God is always available to provide. And wherever the Israelites go, they'll take not only all of this furniture, but this golden table. And they will week after week after week after week for hundreds of years place bread on that table as a symbol that there's never a day, an hour, a moment. There's never a situation in which God is not available and able to provide. Until at one point they come back into the land that Abraham had once lived in. And they settle down in that land. And they come back to the same mountain. This mountain right here in Genesis 22, the one Abraham was on, all those hundreds of years earlier, they come back to that same exact mountain. And it's time now to get rid of the portable tent, which is the tabernacle, and to build a house for God. And they build the temple of the Lord on the mountain in which Abraham first named God as the God who provides. And in that temple, there will be a golden table. And on that table, there will be the bread of the presence. 12 loaves placed week after week after week for hundreds of years. Until finally, about 1,000 years later, in that same region where Abraham lived, in the same region where the temple was, there will come a person who identifies himself as the bread of life, the very provision of God for us. And this man, Jesus, who is God himself incarnate, will feed the multitudes and heal the sick and comfort the brokenhearted. And there will be no such situation in which Jesus can't handle. And those who have been rejected and those who've had no hope and those who couldn't be healed by anybody else can come to Jesus and find in Jesus that God provides. Until one day, by force, he will be led back to that same mountain, to that temple, where he will stand trial, not very far from where there is a golden table with the bread of the presence, there to symbolize that God is always available to provide. And then he will be led to a neighboring mountain, and there he will be crucified, so that the Lord who provides will be free to provide for all who will believe in Jesus, physically, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, for all of eternity. And Christ will be raised from the dead, the symbol that God is available and able to provide for every need. And the church will gather together. And in order to remind themselves that God always provides, they will use bread and a cup. And week after week after week, for hundreds of years and thousands of years, God's people will gather together. You see, the golden table of the bread of the presence of the tabernacle becomes the communion table of the church. And still to this day, there is bread, reminding us that there's never a day, never an hour, never a moment, and never a situation in which God is not able to provide for his people.